Any other members wishing to speak? The Honourable Member for Athabasca Sturgeon Redwater.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It is my privilege to rise in the House today to speak in support of Bill 27, an act to expand conflict of interest rules to agencies, boards, and commissions. Agencies play a very important role in making life better for Albertans, and their executive and board members should be held to the same high ethical standards expected of ourselves as MLAs and of senior public servants. Our government is strongly committed to strengthening conflicts of interest legislation and extending it to senior staff of public agencies, boards, and commissions. The reason for that is conflict of interest requirements are simply not consistent across agencies, and a comprehensive, well-elaborated set of rules is simply good governance. Alberta's public agencies are a critical part of how we deliver services. They, in fact, account for about half of government's total budgetary spending. And with these changes, we can be confident that public agency staff and board members are indeed acting in the public interest. Now, my honourable colleague from Edmonton, Ellerslie, did some background to the bill. What I'd like to do is just kind of explore kind of some of the questions that this new legislation might bring up in the minds of other honourable members and, of course, public. The first question would be just why are we changing the Conflict of Interest Act, and how, in particular, will those changes benefit Albertans? Now, of course, as I just mentioned, we are committed to strengthening conflict of interest legislation, and that's what we're proposing to do. While some public agencies indeed do have conflict of interest requirements in place through their codes of conduct or their employment contracts, there's not a consistent or comprehensive set of rules being applied to public agencies. This speaks to why we need to do that. Now, what is the teeth to this? So what are the penalties for breaches of the Act? So currently, there's an administrative penalty for not disclosing the Ethics Commissioner on time, or for failing to fully disclose conflicts as outlined in the Conflict of Interest Act. This penalty applies to those currently covered under the Act, including MLAs and senior ministerial staff, and cannot exceed $500. It is currently an offence for designated senior officials to violate the post-employment restriction, subject to a fine of up to $50,000. With amendments to this Act, these penalties will become applicable to designated senior officials. And this would put this in alignment with current provisions for ministers and deputy ministers. So another question, kind of following on that, is, has any consideration been given to increasing the penalties for breaching the Act? Now, this is not something that we are proposing to do through these amendments. Now, how will the requirements be enforced? Well, chairs and CEOs and their equivalents would be subject to oversight by the Ethics Commissioner for the statutory requirements that apply to them. In addition, all agency employees, including CEOs and equivalents, and all board members, including chairs, will be subject to conflicts of interest requirements through a code of conduct, which will be required for each public agency. The requirements for codes of conduct aligns with the approach used for the Alberta Public Service. Once again, these will then align it more closely with those in place for us as elected officials, including ministers, as well as requirements in place for deputy ministers. Another question people might have in mind is how do we decide that? Like, how do we decide which agencies should be subject to the additional conflict of interest requirements? This is still work in progress, but there are indeed several considerations, including whether the agency is involved in the following activities. One would be performing a regulatory function. A second one would be making autonomous decisions and or binding decisions. A third one would be managing or allocating substantial amounts of public funding. And finally, extensive interaction with the private sector. So I think with the reasons being stated, you can see these are situations where conflicts of interest might arise on a more frequent basis, and where there might be a greater temptation to end up in such a situation. So another question that that people might ask about this legislation that we're proposing is why do some requirements apply to CEOs and chairs while others apply to board members and agency staff? So just how was it decided which staff would be affected by the changes? Chairs, CEOs, and equivalents be subject to higher levels of requirements than agency staff and board members due to their heightened responsibilities and accountabilities. So, fairly obvious connection there. Chairs, CEOs, and equivalents of significant agencies would also be subject to additional statutory requirements, as well as codes of conduct and core statutory requirements. Now, since these agencies are providing such an important, significant service and function on behalf of government, it is indeed highly appropriate that there be more oversight in place for chairs, CEOs, and equivalents. Now, another question that might be posed is why will some requirements be in legislation while others will be administered through codes of conduct? And there's a good reason for this difference. The use of statutory requirements for board chairs and CEOs and their equivalent creates the ability for the Ethics Commission to provide oversight, including the investigation of potential breaches. This approach recognizes the responsibilities and accountabilities associated with these positions. So that's why that would be, have to go through the Ethics Commissioner. Now, another question might be, how does this apply to post-secondary institutions? So what are the requirements for them? Now, the requirement for post-secondary institutions would be the same, essentially, as for those for other public agencies. However, as with other public agencies, the use of codes of conduct will provide post-secondary institutions with some greater flexibility in order to address their unique needs, such as those, which is unique to post-secondary institutions, having to protect academic freedom. Are there additional requirements to this legislation? Like I said previously, they are the same requirements that ministers and deputy ministers are subject to, and they would include the following. Would be requirement to disclose financial information on direct associates, restrictions on holding public securities unless placed in a blind trust or otherwise approved by the Ethics Commissioner, and a 12-month restriction on taking certain positions after leaving a CEO or other equivalent position. Now, when would these core statutory requirements take effect? That would be...
Hesitate to interrupt the honourable member, but pursuant to Standing Order 4 Sub 2, the House stands adjourned until Tuesday, November 14th at 10 a.m.